At 75, I never imagined I'd be standing in a grocery store at 6 in the morning, scanning barcodes with shaking hands while my nephew's wife texted me angry messages about organic kale being out of stock. But there I was, clutching my phone with one hand and a shopping cart with the other, wondering how I'd become the family's unpaid delivery service. What they didn't know was that every humiliating errand they sent me on was building toward the biggest surprise of their entitled lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Chen, and 6 months ago, I was living what I thought was a comfortable retirement in the guest house behind my late brother's property in Riverside. After Robert passed away last year, his son Michael and daughter-in-law Courtney had graciously allowed me to stay in the small cottage where I'd been helping care for Robert during his final months. I thought they appreciated having family close by, especially since I helped with their twin boys when they needed babysitting. I should have seen the signs earlier. It started small, innocent requests that seemed reasonable enough. Courtney would call me around dinner time, her voice sweet as honey. "Aunt Dorothy, I'm so sorry to bother you, but we're completely out of milk and the boys need it for breakfast tomorrow. Would you mind terribly picking some up?" I'd go myself, but I'm in the middle of a work call that could run late. Of course, I didn't mind. I was retired, I had time, and family helps family. That's what Robert had always taught us growing up. So I'd drive to the store, buy the milk with my own money, and deliver it to their kitchen with a smile. Courtney would thank me profusely, promise to pay me back, and then somehow never quite get around to it. The requests became more frequent. A loaf of bread here, some eggs there, then entire grocery lists that arrived via text message at all hours. Emergency grocery run needed. The boys ate everything, and we have nothing for dinner. You're such a lifesaver, Aunt Dorothy. These messages always came with multiple heart emojis and exclamation points, as if enthusiasm could mask the growing imposition. Within 2 months, I was shopping for their family 3 times a week. Not just basic necessities either, but specific brand requirements that sent me to multiple stores. Courtney insisted on organic everything for the boys. Artisanal bread from the expensive bakery across town, and specialty items that could only be found at the upscale market, where a single bell pepper cost more than I used to spend on vegetables for a week. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday morning in November. I was dealing with a particularly bad flare-up of my arthritis, the kind that made gripping the steering wheel an exercise in endurance. My phone buzzed with another text from Courtney. "Dorothy, super urgent. Michael's boss is coming to dinner tonight and we need ingredients for beef Wellington. I've sent you a list. Need everything by 3 p.m. latest. You're the best." The list was 3 pages long. Beef tenderloin from the butcher shop downtown, puff pastry from the French bakery, specialty mushrooms from the gourmet market, wine from the liquor store with the good selection. The total cost came to over $400, money I paid out of my own checking account, because Courtney's credit card was, according to her hastily sent follow-up text, acting weird today. I spent 6 hours driving between stores in the rain, my joints screaming with every step, loading heavy bags into my car, and then unloading them at their house. When I knocked on the front door, wet and exhausted, Courtney barely looked up from her phone. "Just put everything in the kitchen," she said, waving vaguely toward the back of the house. "I'm dealing with a crisis at work." No thank you, no acknowledgement of the time and effort I'd spent, certainly no offer to reimburse me for the groceries I'd just purchased. That evening, I watched from my cottage window as Michael's boss arrived in his luxury sedan. I could see the dining room through their picture window, elegant place settings and candles flickering on the table. The beef Wellington I'd spent my day procuring was undoubtedly the centerpiece of their impressive dinner party. Yet when Michael's boss complimented the meal, as I'm sure he did, the credit would go entirely to Courtney's culinary skills and thoughtful preparation. The next morning, Courtney called me before 8 o'clock. "Dorothy, last night was such a success. Michael's boss was so impressed. We might actually get that promotion we've been hoping for." She paused, and I waited for some acknowledgement of my contribution to their success. Instead, she continued, Oh, and we're completely out of coffee. The good stuff from that place on 5th Street. Could you grab some this morning? Michael can't function without his caffeine. Something inside me snapped. Courtney, about yesterday's groceries. The total was $412. When should I expect to be reimbursed? There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from sweet to slightly irritated. Dorothy, I thought we talked about this. You know how tight money is for us right now with the mortgage and the boys' school expenses. Besides, you eat dinner with us at least twice a week, so it's not like you're not getting anything out of the arrangement. Twice a week. She was counting the occasional family dinners where I brought dessert and helped clean up afterward as payment for hundreds of dollars in groceries and countless hours of unpaid shopping services. The audacity was breathtaking. I understand money is tight, I said carefully, but I'm on a fixed income too. $400 is a significant expense for me. Dorothy? Her voice now carried the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. You're living in our guest house rent-free. Do you have any idea what that cottage would rent for on the market? At least $1,500 a month. We're saving you $18,000 a year in housing costs. The least you can do is help out with occasional grocery runs. Occasional grocery runs. I wanted to laugh, but there was nothing funny about the situation. In her mind, my free labor wasn't a favor I was doing for family. It was rent payment for the privilege of living in the cottage that Robert had specifically left for my use in his will. I'll get your coffee, I said quietly, and hung up. As I drove to the coffee shop that morning, something fundamental had changed in my understanding of my situation. I wasn't a beloved aunt helping out family members in need. I was free labor, a convenient resource to be utilized without compensation or appreciation. The cottage wasn't a generous gift from family who wanted me close by. It was leverage to ensure my continued service. The coffee shop on 5th Street was the kind of place where a single cup cost more than I used to spend on coffee for a week. As I waited in line behind young professionals ordering complicated drinks with multiple modifications, I caught my reflection in the shop's window. A tired-looking woman in her 70s, clutching a worn purse, about to spend $25 on coffee she didn't even drink, because her nephew's wife couldn't be bothered to make her own morning beverage run. The barista, a young man with kind eyes, noticed me studying the menu with obvious confusion. "First time here?" he asked gently. "Yes, I'm picking up coffee for my family. They said to get the good stuff, but I'm not sure what that means." He helped me select a blend that Courtney would approve of, and as he rang up the purchase, he said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "You know, we offer delivery service now. Might be easier than making the trip yourself." Delivery service. The irony wasn't lost on me. Professional services existed to bring people their groceries and coffee, services they paid for. Yet here I was, a 75-year-old woman providing the same service for free, using my own car, my own gas, my own time, and my own money.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. Instead of waiting for the next shopping list to arrive via text message, I sat down at my small kitchen table and really looked at my financial situation. My Social Security check covered my basic needs, and I had some savings that Robert had helped me build over the years. Nothing extravagant, but enough to live modestly and independently. Or so I thought. When I calculated how much I'd been spending on groceries for Michael and Courtney's family, the number made me dizzy. Over the past 4 months, I'd paid for nearly $3,000 worth of their food, household supplies, and specialty items. $3,000 that had come directly out of my retirement savings, because I'd been too embarrassed to keep asking for reimbursement, after being made to feel like I was being ungrateful for their generosity in letting me live in the cottage. $3,000 that represented months of my Social Security income, gone to subsidize the lifestyle of a family that earned more in a month than I received in a year. That evening, I called my old friend Margaret from the retirement community where I'd volunteered before Robert got sick. We'd kept in touch sporadically, but I hadn't told her much about my living situation since moving to the cottage. "Dorothy." Margaret's voice was warm and welcoming. "How wonderful to hear from you. How are you settling in with your nephew's family?" I found myself telling her everything. The constant shopping requests, the mounting expenses, the way Courtney had reframed my unpaid labor as rent payment. Margaret listened without interrupting, making small, sympathetic sounds that encouraged me to continue. When I finished, there was a long pause. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice careful and measured. "Dorothy, what you're describing sounds like financial exploitation. Have you considered that what they're doing might not be legal?" Financial exploitation. The term hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of my situation as family dynamics gone wrong, a misunderstanding about boundaries and expectations. It hadn't occurred to me that there might be legal implications to what was happening. "They're not forcing me to shop for them," I said weakly. "I could say no." "Could you?" Margaret asked gently. "You're living in their property, you're isolated from other family and friends, and they've made it clear that your housing depends on your continued service. Dorothy, that's not a choice. That's coercion." After I hung up, I sat in the cottage's small living room, looking around at the space that had felt like a haven when I first moved in. Now I could see it differently. The cottage was comfortable but isolated, separated from the main house by a small yard that felt more like a moat than a garden. There was only one entrance to the property, through a gate that Michael controlled. I'd never noticed before how effectively the layout prevented casual visitors or neighbors from stopping by. My phone buzzed with another text from Courtney. "Dorothy! Emergency! The boys have friends coming over tomorrow, and we need snacks and drinks for 8 kids. I've sent you a list. Could you have everything here by noon? You're amazing." I stared at the message for a long time. The list was already in my email, 2 pages of specific brand requirements and dietary restrictions for children I barely knew. The estimated cost would be at least $200, money I didn't really have after the week's other expenses. For the first time since this arrangement had begun, I typed a response that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. "I'm not feeling well tomorrow. You'll need to handle the shopping yourself." The response came back within minutes. "Dorothy, this is really important. Can't you just push through? The boys are counting on this play date, and I can't leave work early again." Again. As if she'd been making sacrifices for her children's social lives instead of relying on me to handle every inconvenience that arose. "I'm sorry, but I can't help tomorrow," I typed back, and then did something I'd never done before. I turned off my phone. The silence that followed was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in months, I was unavailable for emergency grocery runs or last-minute shopping requests. I was just Dorothy Chen, a 75-year-old woman sitting in her cottage, free to spend her evening however she chose. I chose to spend it going through old photo albums, looking at pictures of Robert and me from happier times. In one photo, we were standing in front of his house, the cottage visible in the background. Robert's arm was around my shoulders, and we were both smiling at something the photographer had said. It was taken just 2 years ago, but it felt like a lifetime. Robert had been so proud when he'd shown me the cottage, explaining how he'd had it renovated specifically for me. "Dorothy, I want you to have a place that's truly yours," he'd said. "Somewhere you can be independent but still close to family." Independent. That had been important to him, and it had been important to me too. Yet somehow, in the months since his death, I'd become the opposite of independent. I'd become a resource to be managed, a convenience to be utilized, a problem to be solved with the minimum amount of effort from people who viewed my contributions as obligations rather than gifts. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 12 text messages. Courtney had apparently spent the evening trying to reach me, her messages growing increasingly frantic and then angry as the night wore on. "Dorothy, please call me back. The boys are asking about their play date." "I don't understand why you're not answering. This is really inconsiderate." "Fine." I had to leave work early and spend my entire afternoon shopping. "I hope you're happy." The final message, sent at nearly midnight, was the most revealing. "Michael says we need to have a serious conversation about your living arrangement. This kind of unreliability isn't working for our family." My living arrangement. Not our family situation, not the mutual support system I'd thought we were building, but my tenancy that was now under review because I'd failed to provide adequate service. I made myself coffee, the cheap instant kind I actually preferred, and sat down to think about my options. I could apologize, resume my shopping duties, and hope that things would gradually improve. I could try to negotiate better terms, setting boundaries around what I was willing to do and when. Or I could acknowledge that this living situation had become unsustainable and make plans to leave. The third option terrified me more than I wanted to admit. At 75, starting over felt overwhelming. Finding a new place to live, rebuilding social connections, establishing new routines, all of it seemed impossibly daunting. But staying meant accepting that my value to this family was measured entirely by my willingness to provide unpaid services. Around 10 in the morning, Michael knocked on my cottage door. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as I invited him inside. "Aunt Dorothy? Courtney said you weren't feeling well yesterday. Are you okay?" His concern seemed genuine, and for a moment I felt hopeful that we might be able to work things out. Michael had always been a sweet boy, and even as an adult he'd retained some of that thoughtful nature that had made him Robert's pride and joy. "I'm fine, Michael, just tired." He nodded, looking around the cottage's living room as if seeing it for the first time. "This is a nice place, isn't it? Dad put a lot of work into fixing it up for you." "He did. I'm very grateful." "About yesterday," Michael continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "Courtney was really stressed out, having to leave work early. Her boss wasn't happy about it, and with the promotion possibility, we can't afford to have her looking unreliable." I waited for him to acknowledge that my reliability had been taken for granted, that perhaps there was a better way to handle their shopping needs. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed me an app I'd never seen before. "We've set up an account for you with this grocery delivery service. It's like Uber, but for shopping you can just order whatever we need and have it delivered directly to the house. That way you don't have to drive around so much, and we can make sure everything gets here on time." I stared at the phone screen, trying to process what he was telling me. They'd created a system that would make it easier for me to shop for them, not a system that would reduce my shopping responsibilities. The inconvenience of driving was being addressed, but the financial burden and time commitment remained entirely mine. "Michael, who's paying for these deliveries?" He looked confused by the question. "The same way we've been handling it. You order what we need, and it gets delivered. The service fee is only a few dollars per order." A few dollars per order, plus tips for the shoppers, plus markup on all the groceries, plus the cost of the groceries themselves. Still entirely my financial responsibility, but now with additional fees attached. "And the groceries themselves?" I pressed. "Who's paying for those?" Michael's expression shifted slightly, the discomfort returning. "Aunt Dorothy, we've talked about this. You're living here rent-free. The grocery expenses are basically your contribution to the household." Rent-free. The phrase that had become their justification for everything. As if the cottage Robert had specifically prepared for me was charity they were providing, rather than the arrangement my brother had intended. "Michael, in the past 4 months, I've spent over $3,000 on groceries for your family. That's more than most people pay in rent for a place like this." $3,000? He looked genuinely surprised. "That can't be right." I excused myself and returned with my bank statements and a notebook where I'd been tracking the expenses. Michael's face grew pale as he reviewed the numbers, adding up the amounts I'd spent at various stores, the frequency of shopping trips, the increasing cost of specialty items Courtney had requested. "I had no idea it was this much," he said quietly. "Courtney handles all the grocery planning. I just assumed it was, normal family helping out." 95 shopping trips in 4 months, I said, reading from my notebook. "An average of 6 trips per week, including 3 emergency runs for specialty items. The most expensive single trip was $412 for your dinner party last week." Michael was quiet for a long time, studying the numbers. When he finally looked up, his expression was troubled. "Aunt Dorothy, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much this had gotten out of hand." For a moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe this was the breakthrough we needed, the moment when my nephew would recognize that the arrangement had become unbalanced and unfair. "I'll talk to Courtney about scaling back the requests," he continued. "Maybe we can limit it to once or twice a week. and we'll make sure to reimburse you for the major expenses. Once or twice a week. He was offering to reduce my unpaid labor from 6 trips per week to 2. As if this represented a generous compromise, rather than an acknowledgement that I should never have been expected to provide this service at all. Michael, I said carefully, what if I just stopped shopping for your family entirely? What if you handled your own grocery needs like every other household in America? He looked at me as if I'd suggested something completely unreasonable. But you have the time, and you're such a good shopper. You know exactly what brands the boys like, where to find the best deals. It would take Courtney forever to figure all that out. It would take Courtney forever to learn her own children's preferences and manage her own household supplies. The woman who held down a demanding job, managed social calendars, and successfully impressed her husband's boss with elaborate dinner parties was apparently incapable of purchasing groceries without my assistance. I think I need some time to consider my options, I said finally. Michael nodded, though he still looked confused by my reluctance to continue providing a service that, in his mind, was a reasonable exchange for my housing. Of course, take all the time you need. Just remember that this arrangement has been working pretty well for everyone. Everyone except me, I thought, but didn't say. After Michael left, I spent the afternoon walking around the neighborhood for the first time since I'd moved to the cottage. I'd been so busy running errands for Courtney that I'd never explored the area where I was actually living. The streets were lined with comfortable middle-class homes, most with well-maintained yards and signs of active family life. Children's bicycles in driveways, gardens that showed care and attention, the kind of neighborhood where people probably knew their neighbors' names. Yet I realized I'd never met a single neighbor. Every time I left the cottage, it was to drive somewhere else, to shop for someone else's needs, to fulfill someone else's requests. I'd been living here for 6 months and had no connection to the community around me. At the corner of the neighborhood, I discovered a small commercial district I'd never noticed before. A coffee shop that wasn't the expensive place on 5th Street, a bookstore with a cozy reading area, a small market that specialized in local produce. The kind of places where I might have become a regular customer if I'd had time for my own errands instead of constantly running errands for others. I stopped at the coffee shop and ordered a simple cup of regular coffee for $3 instead of the $25 specialty blend I'd been purchasing for Courtney. The barista was a middle-aged woman with a friendly smile who asked if I was new to the area. Fairly new, I said. I'm staying with family nearby. That's nice. Family is so important, especially as we get older. Are you enjoying having time with them? The question stopped me cold. Was I enjoying time with family? When was the last time I'd actually spent quality time with Michael, Courtney, or the boys that wasn't related to some service I was providing? When was the last time we'd had a conversation that wasn't about shopping lists or delivery schedules? It's complicated, I admitted. The barista nodded knowingly. Family often is. But I hope you're making time for yourself too. That's just as important. Making time for myself. The concept felt foreign after months of structuring my days around other people's needs and schedules. When was the last time I'd read a book for pleasure, watched a movie I chose, or simply sat quietly without worrying about the next text message that would arrive with a new list of demands? I spent an hour in the coffee shop, sipping my affordable coffee and watching people go about their daily lives. Business people grabbing quick lunches, mothers with young children sharing pastries, elderly couples reading newspapers together. Normal life. The kind I'd been missing while serving as an unpaid personal shopper for people who saw my labor as an entitlement rather than a gift. When I returned to the cottage, there were 3 new messages from Courtney. The boys were out of their favorite cereal, they needed ingredients for tomorrow's dinner, and could I please pick up Michael's prescription from the pharmacy while I was out? The assumption that I was always available, always willing, always ready to drop whatever I might be doing to handle their needs. For the first time, I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat down and did something I hadn't done in years. I made a list of what I wanted from my life. Not what other people needed from me, but what would make me happy and fulfilled. I wanted time to read without interruption. I wanted to reconnect with old friends I'd lost touch with, while constantly running errands. I wanted to explore my new neighborhood, maybe join the book club I'd seen advertised at the local bookstore. I wanted to volunteer again, this time for organizations I chose rather than family members who'd claimed my services. Most importantly, I wanted to feel valued for who I was, not what I could provide. I wanted relationships based on mutual affection and respect, not transactions where my worth was measured by my willingness to serve. Looking at that list, I realized that none of those things were possible in my current situation. As long as I remained financially and emotionally dependent on Michael and Courtney, as long as I accepted their definition of our arrangement as fair and reasonable, I would continue to be a resource rather than a person. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Robert's death. I called an old friend from my previous life, someone who'd known me before I became the family's designated shopper. Eleanor had been my neighbor for 15 years before I moved to the cottage, and we'd maintained a casual friendship based on shared interests in gardening and local history. "Dorothy," Eleanor's voice was delighted. "How wonderful to hear from you. How are you settling in with your nephew's family?" I found myself telling Eleanor the truth about my situation, something I'd been too embarrassed to admit to anyone else. She listened with growing concern as I described the constant shopping requests, the financial burden, the way my living arrangement had been reframed as compensation for services rendered. "Dorothy," Eleanor said when I finished, "what you're describing sounds awful. Are you happy there?" The question was so simple, yet no one had asked it before. Not Michael, not Courtney, not even Margaret when I'd confided in her about the financial aspects of my situation. Everyone had assumed that living with family was automatically preferable to any alternative, that I should be grateful for their generosity regardless of what that generosity actually entailed. "No," I said, the admission feeling like a revelation. "I'm not happy." "Then why are you staying?" It was a fair question, one that forced me to examine my own motivations. Was I staying because I had no other options, or because I was afraid to explore other options? Was I accepting this treatment because I truly believed it was the best I could expect, or because confronting the situation seemed more frightening than enduring it? "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm 75 years old, Eleanor. Starting over feels impossible." "Honey," Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, "you're not starting over. You're continuing a life that got temporarily derailed. There's a difference." After we hung up, I spent hours thinking about Eleanor's words. My life hadn't ended when Robert died, though in many ways I'd been acting as if it had. I'd allowed grief and uncertainty to make me passive, accepting whatever arrangements other people made for me rather than actively choosing what I wanted. But I was still here, still capable of making decisions and changes. The question wasn't whether I was too old to start over, but whether I was willing to stop accepting less than I deserved. The next morning, I woke up with unusual clarity about what I needed to do. I made myself breakfast, real breakfast with eggs and toast, instead of the quick coffee and pastry I'd been grabbing between shopping trips. I read the newspaper from beginning to end, something I hadn't done in months. I called Eleanor back and asked if she'd help me research retirement communities and independent living options in the area. Then I turned off my phone and spent the day doing exactly what I wanted to do. I visited the bookstore I'd discovered, joined their monthly book club, and purchased 3 novels I'd been meaning to read. I stopped by the local market and bought ingredients for a dinner I would cook for myself, choosing items based on my own preferences rather than someone else's dietary restrictions and brand requirements. It was the most peaceful day I'd had since moving to the cottage. When I finally turned my phone back on that evening, I had 14 missed calls and 23 text messages. The tone of the messages progressed from confused to concerned, to irritated to angry, as the day wore on. Courtney had apparently needed me to pick up party supplies for one of the boys' school events, and my unavailability had forced her to leave work early again. The final message, sent just an hour before I turned my phone back on, was from Michael. "Aunt Dorothy, we need to talk. This isn't working." I stared at that message for a long time. This isn't working. For the first time since I'd moved to the cottage, Michael was acknowledging that our arrangement had problems. What remained to be seen was whether he understood that the problem stemmed from their expectations rather than my performance. I called him back and he answered on the first ring. "Aunt Dorothy, where have you been? Courtney's been trying to reach you all day. I turned off my phone, I said simply. I needed a day to myself. There was a pause. A day to yourself? But Courtney really needed your help with the school event. She had to leave work early because you weren't available. Michael, I'm not Courtney's employee. I don't have set hours or guaranteed availability. If she needed help with a school event, she should have planned ahead instead of assuming I would be on call. Another pause, longer this time. When Michael spoke again, his tone was different, more formal. I think we need to sit down and discuss the terms of your living arrangement here. It's clear that we have different expectations. I agree, I said. When would you like to have that conversation? Tomorrow evening, after the boys go to bed? That works for me. As I hung up, I felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Tomorrow's conversation would determine whether my relationship with Michael's family could be rebuilt on healthier terms, or whether I would need to make the difficult decision to leave. Either way, I would no longer accept being treated as a resource to be utilized, rather than a person to be valued. That night, I spent hours preparing for the conversation, writing down my thoughts and concerns, practicing how to articulate my needs without sounding ungrateful or demanding. I wanted to be clear about my boundaries, while remaining open to compromise, if Michael and Courtney were willing to acknowledge their role in creating an unsustainable situation. But as I prepared my talking points, a small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering something that I had been trying to ignore for months. What if this conversation didn't lead to the changes I hoped for? What if Michael and Courtney were unwilling to modify their expectations or their treatment of me? What if it was time to consider that there might be people in the world who would value my company and contributions without expecting me to serve as their unpaid personal shopper? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a life where my worth wasn't measured by my willingness to run errands, where my time and energy were respected, where I could build relationships based on mutual affection rather than one-sided service. It was a lovely thought. Now I just had to find the courage to pursue it. The conversation with Michael and Courtney that evening went exactly as I had feared it would. We sat around their dining room table, the same table where I'd served countless meals I'd shopped for and prepared, while they explained their perspective on our arrangement with the patience of adults correcting a confused child. "Aunt Dorothy," Courtney began, her voice taking on the syrupy tone she used when she wanted something. "We're concerned that you might be feeling overwhelmed by helping out with the family shopping. We don't want you to feel like it's a burden." I waited for her to continue, hoping she might acknowledge the financial strain or the excessive demands, but instead she pulled out a printed schedule from her laptop bag. "So we've created a more organized system. Shopping trips will be limited to Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, with emergency runs only for truly urgent situations. We've also mapped out the most efficient routes between stores to minimize your driving time." She slid the paper across the table to me. It was a detailed spreadsheet with store locations, optimal shopping times, and estimated completion schedules. My life as their personal shopper had been systematized and optimized, but not eliminated. "This way," Michael added, "you'll know exactly what's expected and when, so you can plan your other activities around your shopping responsibilities." My other activities. As if my life outside of serving their needs was a hobby that should be scheduled around my primary function as their unpaid grocery service. "What about the financial aspect?" I asked. "The money I've been spending on your groceries?" Courtney's expression tightened slightly. "Dorothy, we've talked about this. The cottage rental value more than covers any grocery expenses. If anything, you're coming out ahead in this arrangement." "I've calculated my expenses over the past 4 months," I said, pulling out my own documentation. $3,047, not including gas, wear and tear on my car, or the value of my time. "How does that compare to the rental value of the cottage?" Michael looked uncomfortable as he glanced at the numbers. "Aunt Dorothy, you're thinking about this too much like a business transaction. We're family. Family helps each other out." "Family does help each other," I agreed. "But help should be mutual. What has your family done to help me lately?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Courtney's face flushed slightly, and Michael shifted in his chair. They clearly hadn't expected me to question the fundamental premise of our arrangement. "We've provided you with housing," Courtney said finally. A beautiful, private cottage where you can live independently without the costs and hassles of finding your own place. Robert left me the cottage in his will, I said quietly. I'm not living here as your tenant. I'm living here because my brother wanted me to have a place in the family. Another uncomfortable silence. Michael cleared his throat. Well, technically, Dad left the property to me, and the cottage is part of the property. So while I'm happy to honor his wishes about you living here, the legal reality is that this is my house. The legal reality. They'd consulted someone about the property arrangement, probably to determine exactly how much leverage they had over my living situation. The cottage that had felt like a gift from Robert was actually a tool they could use to ensure my continued compliance. I see, I said. So if I'm unwilling to continue providing shopping services, what happens to my housing arrangement? Michael and Courtney exchanged a look. We're not saying that, Michael said quickly. We're just trying to find a system that works for everyone. But they weren't denying it either. The implication was clear. My continued residence in the cottage depended on my willingness to serve as their personal shopper. Refuse the shopping duties and my housing security would be reconsidered. I need some time to think about this, I said, standing up from the table. Of course, Courtney said, her sweet tone returning now that she felt the conversation had gone in their favor. Take all the time you need. The new schedule doesn't start until next week. As I walked back to the cottage that night, I felt the weight of my situation settling around me like a heavy coat. I wasn't a beloved family member being invited to share in their lives. I was an employee living in company housing, expected to provide services in exchange for continued accommodation. The only difference was that most employees received wages for their work, while I was paying for the privilege of serving them. Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way Courtney would text me shopping lists without asking if I was available, simply assuming I would comply. The way Michael would mention my errands to his friends as examples of how helpful I was, as if my labor was a personal accomplishment he could claim credit for. The way the boys had been taught to bring their requests directly to me rather than their parents when they wanted special treats or snacks. I'd become so integrated into their household management system that they couldn't imagine functioning without me. But more troubling was the realization that they'd never actually tried to function without me. Even before Robert's death, when I'd simply been helping out, occasionally while caring for my brother, Courtney had been gradually increasing her reliance on my services. Looking back, I could see the pattern. It had started with small favors during Robert's illness, when I was already running errands for his medications and doctor's appointments. Since you're going to the pharmacy anyway, could you grab some things for us? Had seemed reasonable. But each favor had led to larger requests, and each successful completion had established precedent for the next imposition. I'd been groomed for this role so gradually that I hadn't noticed it happening. By the time Robert died and I moved into the cottage full-time, the expectation of my shopping services was already established. The only thing that changed was the volume and frequency of requests. On Thursday morning, I received the week's first shopping list under Courtney's new organized system. 23 items ranging from organic produce to specialty cleaning products, with specific brand requirements and store preferences noted for each item. The estimated cost was over $200, and the list included a note reminding me that Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday were now my designated shopping days. I stared at the list for a long time, thinking about the conversation I'd had with Eleanor about continuing my life rather than starting over. What kind of life was I continuing if I spent 3 days a week serving other people's needs and the other 4 days recovering from the effort? Instead of heading to the first store on Courtney's optimized route, I drove to the retirement community where I'd volunteered before Robert's illness. Sunset Manor was a sprawling complex of independent living apartments, assisted care units, and community facilities. I'd spent 2 years volunteering in their library and activity center, helping organize book clubs and game nights for residents. The volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Patterson, was delighted to see me. "Dorothy, how wonderful! Are you interested in coming back to volunteer? We've missed you terribly." "Actually," I said, "I was wondering if you might have any information about your independent living apartments. Do you have a waiting list?" Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to one of understanding and sympathy. She'd worked in senior living long enough to recognize when someone was exploring their options out of necessity rather than casual interest. We do have a waiting list, but it's not as long as you might think. Many people inquire but then decide to stay in their current situations. Would you like me to show you around some of our available units? The apartment she showed me was small but bright, with large windows overlooking a garden courtyard where residents could be seen reading and playing cards. It had a full kitchen, a comfortable living area, and a bedroom that was larger than the one I currently occupied in the cottage. The monthly rent was less than what I'd been spending on groceries for Michael and Courtney's family. The rent includes utilities, basic cable, and access to all community facilities, Mrs. Patterson explained. We have a library, fitness center, craft rooms, and organized activities 7 days a week. Meals are available in the dining room, but most independent living residents prefer to cook for themselves. She showed me the community spaces, including a large kitchen where residents could host dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Many of our residents form close friendships here. There's always someone to talk to if you want company, but plenty of privacy when you prefer to be alone. Company when I wanted it, privacy when I needed it. The concept felt luxurious after months of being constantly on call for other people's needs. What's the application process like? I asked. Fairly straightforward. Financial verification to ensure you can afford the monthly payments, a basic health assessment, and references from previous landlords or family members. Most applications are processed within 2 weeks. Financial verification. That reminded me of something I'd been avoiding thinking about since the conversation with Michael and Courtney. If I was going to make a change, I needed to have a clear picture of my actual financial situation. Not just my monthly expenses, but my overall assets and long-term security. That afternoon, I drove to the bank where I'd maintained accounts since before my marriage. I hadn't paid much attention to my financial statements in recent months. Too focused on daily expenses to consider my broader economic picture. But if I was going to make decisions about my living situation, I needed to understand exactly what resources I had available. The bank manager, Mr. Rodriguez, was someone I'd worked with for years during the period when I'd helped Robert manage his finances during his illness. He welcomed me warmly and pulled up my account information on his computer screen. "Mrs. Chen, how can I help you today?" "I'd like to review my accounts," I said. "All of them. I'm considering some changes in my living situation and want to make sure I understand my financial position." Mr. Rodriguez nodded and began printing out statements. "Of course. Let's start with your checking and savings accounts, then move on to your investment portfolio and retirement accounts." Investment portfolio. The phrase surprised me. I'd completely forgotten about the small investment account I'd opened years ago, with money from my late husband's life insurance. It had been generating quarterly statements that I'd filed away without reading, assuming the balance was too small to matter. "Your investment account has performed quite well over the past decade," Mr. Rodriguez said, handing me a statement. "The initial $25,000 investment has grown substantially." I looked at the number on the bottom of the page and felt my breath catch. The account balance was $127,000. Money I'd forgotten I had. Money that had been quietly growing while I worried about whether I could afford groceries for people who treated my generosity as an obligation. "This can't be right," I said, staring at the statement. "The markets have been very good to long-term investors," Mr. Rodriguez explained. "Your portfolio is conservatively managed, but even conservative investments have seen significant growth over the past 15 years. And since you've never taken any distributions, all the gains have been reinvested." He pulled up additional statements showing my other accounts. My savings account, which I'd thought contained about $8,000, actually held nearly $15,000. My checking account was lower than I'd realized due to the recent grocery expenses, but my overall financial picture was far stronger than I'd understood. In total, Mr. Rodriguez said, "Your liquid assets are approximately $155,000. That's not including your Social Security benefits or any other retirement income streams. $155,000. I sat in the bank office staring at the numbers, trying to process what this meant for my situation. I wasn't a charity case dependent on my nephew's generosity for housing. I wasn't an elderly woman with limited options and no alternatives. I was someone with substantial financial resources who had been allowing herself to be exploited because she hadn't realized her own strength. Mr. Rodriguez, I said slowly, if someone wanted to live independently on this amount of money, supplemented by Social Security, what kind of lifestyle could they afford? He pulled out a calculator and spent a few minutes running numbers. Assuming conservative investment management and reasonable spending habits, this amount could support a comfortable middle-class lifestyle indefinitely. Rent in a nice apartment, reliable transportation, healthcare coverage, travel, entertainment, dining out regularly. You wouldn't be wealthy, but you'd certainly be financially secure. Financially secure, independent, able to make choices based on my preferences rather than other people's demands. The conversation was revelatory in a way that made me feel both empowered and foolish. Empowered because I suddenly had options I hadn't known existed. Foolish because I'd been living like a dependent when I was actually financially self-sufficient. I'd like to set up automatic transfers, I said. A certain amount each month from my investment account to my checking account. I want to make sure I have adequate liquid funds for monthly expenses. As we worked out the details, I felt a shift in how I viewed my situation. I wasn't trapped in the cottage because I had nowhere else to go. I was there because I'd chosen to stay, and I could just as easily choose to leave. That evening, I called Eleanor to tell her about my discoveries at the bank. Her reaction was exactly what I needed to hear. Dorothy, this is wonderful news! You have so many options available to you. Have you thought about what you'd like to do with this newfound freedom? I'm still processing it all, I admitted, but I think I'd like to move somewhere where I can be appreciated for who I am, not what I can provide. That sounds like a perfect goal. Have you considered looking into places where you might meet people who share your interests? Maybe a community with other people who might appreciate your companionship and kindness? The word companionship stuck with me. When was the last time someone had sought out my company simply because they enjoyed talking with me? When had I last had a conversation that wasn't about shopping lists or errands or household management? Over the weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I ignored Courtney's Saturday shopping list and instead drove to the art museum downtown. They were featuring an exhibit on local history that included photographs and artifacts from the early days of the city where I had lived most of my life. As I walked through the exhibit, I found myself in conversation with other visitors who shared my interest in local history. An elderly gentleman named Frank pointed out details in the photographs that I hadn't noticed, and we spent nearly an hour discussing how the city had changed over the decades we'd both lived there. Are you a member of the Historical Society? Frank asked as we finished viewing the exhibit. No, but I've always been interested in local history. You should consider joining. We meet monthly and often have fascinating guest speakers. Plus, we're always looking for volunteers to help with research projects and community events. He handed me a flyer with meeting information, and I realized this was exactly the kind of connection Eleanor had been talking about. People who might appreciate my interests and knowledge, who might value my company for reasons that had nothing to do with my willingness to run errands. When I returned to the cottage that afternoon, there were 6 missed calls and 11 text messages from Courtney. The progression was familiar. Confusion about why I hadn't completed the shopping list, concern about whether something was wrong, and finally irritation about the inconvenience my absence had caused. Dorothy, I don't understand why you're not responding. The boys are asking about their snacks for tomorrow's field trip, and I don't have time to shop for them myself. Please call me back immediately. I looked at the messages for a long time before responding with a simple text. I had other plans today. You'll need to handle the shopping yourself. The response came back within minutes. What other plans? You never mentioned having plans. This is really inconsiderate, Dorothy. What other plans? As if the idea that I might have interests or activities beyond serving their household needs was completely incomprehensible. As if my life outside of their requirements was so minimal that it couldn't possibly interfere with my availability. That evening, Michael called to discuss what Courtney had described as my, quote, increasingly unreliable behavior. Aunt Dorothy, Courtney says you didn't handle the shopping today. Is everything okay? Everything is fine, Michael. I simply had other plans. But it was one of your scheduled shopping days. We talked about the new system, and you seemed to agree to it. I don't recall agreeing to anything. I said I needed time to think about it. There was a pause. Well, what did you decide? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my discovery at the bank, giving me courage I hadn't possessed a week earlier. I have decided that I'm no longer available to serve as your family's personal shopper. What do you mean? I mean that I won't be picking up groceries, running errands, or handling shopping requests anymore. You'll need to manage your household needs the same way every other family in America does. The silence that followed was so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Aunt Dorothy, I think you're upset about something, and maybe we should talk about this in person when you've had time to calm down. Calm down? He was treating my decision like an emotional outburst, rather than a rational choice made by an adult, with every right to determine how she spent her time and money. I'm completely calm, Michael, and I'm completely serious. I will no longer be shopping for your family. But what about the cottage arrangement? We talked about how the shopping was part of your contribution to the household. Then I suppose we need to discuss alternative arrangements. Another long pause. Alternative arrangements? I can pay fair market rent for the cottage, or I can move somewhere else, but I won't continue to provide unpaid labor as a condition of my housing. You want to pay rent, Aunt Dorothy? That doesn't make any sense. The shopping arrangement was working fine for everyone. It wasn't working for me, Michael. It was costing me thousands of dollars and consuming most of my time. That's not an arrangement that works for anyone. I could hear him discussing something with Courtney in the background, their voices muffled but clearly agitated. When he returned to the phone, his tone had shifted to something more businesslike. We'll need to think about this, Aunt Dorothy. The cottage situation is more complicated than just paying rent. There are legal considerations, property management issues, insurance implications. We can't just change the arrangement overnight. Legal considerations, insurance implications. They were searching for reasons why my proposal was impossible. Why I couldn't simply choose to pay rent like any other tenant rather than working as their unpaid employee. Take all the time you need to think about it, I said. But I won't be doing any more shopping regardless of what you decide about the cottage. After I hung up, I sat in the cottage's small living room, feeling a mixture of anxiety and liberation. I'd finally drawn a clear boundary, stated my position without ambiguity, and refused to continue accepting treatment that diminished my dignity and depleted my resources. But I'd also likely triggered a conflict that could result in my having to leave the only connection I had left to Robert and the family he'd wanted me to remain close to. The cottage had been his gift to me, his way of ensuring I'd always have a place in the family structure. By rejecting the terms Michael and Courtney had imposed on that gift, I might be losing it entirely. That night, I called Mrs. Patterson at Sunset Manor and asked to be placed on the waiting list for an independent living apartment. I also researched other retirement communities in the area, comparing amenities, costs, and availability. If Michael and Courtney decided that my refusal to serve as their personal shopper made me unsuitable for continued residence in the cottage, I wanted to be prepared with alternatives. But as I researched my options, I realized something that surprised me. Moving to a retirement community wasn't just a backup plan in case I lost the cottage. It was actually an appealing option that offered things I couldn't have in my current situation. Social connections with people my own age, activities designed around my interests, and most importantly, relationships that weren't based on what services I could provide. For the first time since Robert's death, I was looking forward to my future rather than simply enduring my present circumstances. I had resources I'd forgotten about, options I hadn't considered, and the financial freedom to make choices based on what would make me happy rather than what other people expected from me. The next few days passed quietly. I didn't receive any shopping lists from Courtney, though I did notice Michael's car pulling up to various grocery stores and pharmacies during times when he would normally be at work. The reality of managing their household needs without my assistance was apparently requiring significant adjustments to their schedules. On Wednesday evening, Courtney knocked on my cottage door. She looked tired and slightly frazzled, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of stress. Dorothy, could I come in for a minute? I think we got off on the wrong foot with this whole shopping situation. I invited her inside and offered her tea, which she accepted gratefully. We sat in my small living room, and for a moment she seemed less like the demanding daughter-in-law who'd been treating me like a convenience service, and more like a young mother struggling to balance multiple responsibilities. "I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for our family," she began. "Maybe I haven't expressed that enough, but your help has meant a lot to us." "Thank you," I said, waiting to see where the conversation would lead. "The thing is, Dorothy, these past few days have been really difficult. I had to leave work early twice to handle errands that you normally take care of. Michael's been stressed because he's trying to pick up the slack, but his work schedule doesn't really allow for daytime shopping trips." She paused, apparently expecting me to respond to this information with an offer to resume my shopping duties. When I remained silent, she continued. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the financial aspect being a problem. Maybe we could work out some kind of reimbursement system, or I could take over the actual purchasing and just have you handle the driving and carrying." Driving and carrying. She was offering to modify the arrangement so that I would serve as her chauffeur and physical labor while she maintained control over the shopping decisions. The financial burden would be reduced, but the time commitment and physical demands would remain entirely mine. "Courtney," I said gently, "I don't think you understand what I'm saying. I'm not looking for modifications to our current arrangement. I'm ending my role as your family shopper entirely." Her face flushed slightly. "But why? I thought we were like family. I thought you enjoyed helping us out. We are family, which is exactly why this arrangement has been so painful. Family relationships should be based on mutual care and respect, not on one person serving the others in exchange for basic needs like housing." "I don't understand what you mean by serving us. You're not our servant, Dorothy. You're a valued member of our household." "Valued for what, Courtney? When was the last time you invited me to dinner just because you enjoyed my company? When have we ever had a conversation that wasn't about errands you needed me to run?" She was quiet for a moment, apparently trying to remember a recent interaction that didn't involve shopping lists or household requests. The fact that she couldn't immediately think of one seemed to register with her. "We've all been busy," she said finally. "But that doesn't mean we don't care about you as a person. I'm sure you do care about me, but caring about someone and treating them with respect are different things. I've been treated like a convenience service, not like a family member." Courtney's expression hardened slightly. "Dorothy, I think you're being unfair. We've provided you with beautiful housing, we include you in family activities, we've made you feel welcome here. If you're not happy with the arrangement, maybe the problem isn't with us." There it was, the suggestion that my dissatisfaction was a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to unreasonable treatment. The idea that I should be grateful for inclusion in a family structure that required me to pay for the privilege through unpaid labor. "You're right that if I'm not happy with the arrangement, I should make changes," I said. "That's exactly what I'm doing." "By refusing to help us anymore? By making our lives more difficult because you're having some kind of crisis about getting older?" A crisis about getting older. She'd reduced my assertion of boundaries and self-respect to an emotional breakdown caused by age-related confusion. The dismissal was so complete and so condescending that I felt any remaining doubt about my decision evaporate. "Courtney, I think this conversation has run its course. I've made my position clear, and I don't plan to change my mind." She stood up abruptly, her attempt at reconciliation abandoned. "Fine. But don't expect Michael and me to pretend that this decision doesn't affect our relationship. You're choosing to make yourself a burden instead of a helpful member of this family. A burden. Because I was unwilling to continue subsidizing their lifestyle with my money and labor, I have become a burden." The accusation was revealing in its honesty. In their minds, my value was entirely tied to my utility, and without that utility, I was simply an unwelcome expense. After she left, I spent the evening on my laptop, finalizing my application for the apartment at Sunset Manor. Mrs. Patterson had called earlier in the week to let me know that a unit would be available at the beginning of next month, and that my application was being processed with priority due to my previous volunteer work with the community. I'd also been researching the local historical society that Frank had mentioned at the museum. Their next meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and they were planning a presentation about immigrant communities in the early 20th century. Given my own family's history as Chinese immigrants, the topic felt personally relevant and intellectually engaging. For the first time in months, I had social plans that had nothing to do with serving other people's needs. I was looking forward to meeting people who might appreciate my knowledge and experiences, who might value my companionship for its own sake, rather than for the services I could provide. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how much my perspective had changed since my conversation with the bank manager. A week ago, I'd felt trapped and dependent, worried about my financial security and my limited options. Tonight, I felt empowered and optimistic, excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. The cottage had been Robert's gift to me, his way of ensuring I'd always have a place in the family. But somehow, that gift had been transformed into a tool for my exploitation. The generosity my brother had intended had been perverted into a system that diminished my dignity and depleted my resources. But I didn't have to accept that perversion. I had choices, resources, and the power to create a life that honored Robert's memory by honoring my own worth. He'd wanted me to be close to family, but not at the expense of my own well-being. He'd wanted me to be secure and independent, not dependent and exploited. Tomorrow, I would start the process of reclaiming the independence and dignity that Robert had intended for me. And for the first time since his death, I felt confident that I was making decisions he would have supported and admired. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the community room at Sunset Manor, surrounded by my new neighbors from the Historical Society meeting, when my phone rang with a call from Michael. I'd been expecting this conversation since receiving the certified letter from their attorney 2 days earlier, demanding that I vacate the cottage within 30 days for breach of housing agreement terms. Aunt Dorothy? Michael's voice was strained when I answered. We need to talk. This legal situation has gotten out of hand. Has it? I said, glancing around at the friendly faces of people who had spent the evening listening to my presentation about Chinese immigrant businesses in early Riverside. These people valued my knowledge and perspective, not my ability to carry their groceries. The lawyer says you're refusing to cooperate with the eviction process. He says you've hired your own attorney and are claiming some kind of legal right to the cottage. I had indeed hired an attorney, a sharp young woman named Jessica Martinez, who specialized in elder law, and had taken a particular interest in my case when I explained how my housing had been used as leverage to compel unpaid labor. The cottage was left to me in Robert's will, I said calmly. Your attorney might want to review that document more carefully. There was a long pause. Aunt Dorothy, Dad left the entire property to me. The cottage is part of the property. Actually, Michael, your father left the main house and grounds to you. The cottage was bequeathed to me as a separate legal entity. It has its own deed, its own property tax assessment, and its own legal description. Your lawyer should have discovered this during his research. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. In their rush to find legal grounds for my eviction, they had assumed the cottage was simply an accessory building on Michael's property. They had never bothered to research the actual legal status of my residence. That's impossible, Michael said finally. I would have known if Dad had given you part of the property. Would you? When was the last time you read your father's will carefully? When did you last review the property deeds? Your father was very thorough about ensuring my security, Michael. He just didn't expect that you and Courtney would try to exploit me. I could hear muffled conversation in the background, Michael presumably relaying this information to Courtney and their attorney. When he returned to the phone, his tone had shifted to something approaching panic. Even if that's true, there must be some way to resolve this. We can't afford to maintain 2 separate properties. The taxes alone are going to be a nightmare. I agree, I said. Which is why I'm prepared to make you an offer. What kind of offer? I looked around the comfortable community room where I'd spent the evening engaged in intellectually stimulating conversation with people who appreciated my company. Mrs. Patterson had already shown me 3 different apartments in the complex, each more appealing than the cottage that had become a symbol of my exploitation. I'll buy the cottage from you, I said. Fair market value, cash transaction, closed within 30 days. Buy it? Aunt Dorothy, where would you get that kind of money? The question revealed everything about their assumptions regarding my financial situation. They had created an entire legal strategy based on the belief that I was a dependent elderly woman with no resources and no options. The possibility that I might have substantial assets had never occurred to them. "I have sufficient funds for the purchase," I said simply. "But how much are we talking about?" "The cottage would be worth at least $200,000 on the current market." "$250," I corrected. "I had it appraised last week. My offer is $275, which is above market value to compensate you for the quick transaction timeline." The phone went silent for so long I thought the call had been disconnected. Finally, Michael spoke in a voice I barely recognized. $275,000? In cash? That's correct. Aunt Dorothy, where did you get that kind of money? I've always had it, Michael. You simply never bothered to ask about my financial situation. You assumed I was destitute because that assumption justified treating me like unpaid help. More muffled conversation in the background, and then Courtney's voice came on the line, shrill with disbelief. "Dorothy, there's no way you have access to that much money. If you had been wealthy all along, why did you let us pay for your groceries and expenses?" "Courtney, you never paid for my groceries or expenses. I paid for your groceries and expenses, to the tune of several $1,000s over the past 6 months. Money I'm no longer interested in recovering, since I consider it payment for a very valuable education about your character." "This is ridiculous," Courtney said. "Even if you have some money saved, you can't afford to spend it all on a cottage. What would you live on?" "I appreciate your concern about my financial planning," I said, "but my resources are more substantial than you realize. The cottage purchase would represent less than 20% of my available assets." The gasp that followed this revelation was audible even through the phone. I could picture Courtney's face as she processed the implications of what I'd just told them. If the cottage cost represented only 20% of my wealth, I was worth well over $1 million. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Would you like me to provide financial documentation to support my offer? I'm sure your attorney would appreciate seeing proof of funds before advising you on whether to accept the purchase proposal." Michael's voice returned to the phone, shaky and uncertain. "Aunt Dorothy, I don't understand. If you've been wealthy all this time, why didn't you tell us? Why did you live like you were struggling financially?" "I never lived like I was struggling, Michael. I lived modestly because that's my preference, not because of financial limitations. The difference is that modest living was my choice, while serving as your family's unpaid shopper was presented to me as an obligation. But if you had money, you could have just paid for groceries instead of shopping for them yourself. You could have hired a service to handle all the errands." "I could have," I agreed, "just like you could have hired a service instead of expecting me to provide one for free. The issue was never about money, Michael. It was about respect." Courtney grabbed the phone again. "Respect? Dorothy, we included you in everything. We treated you like family. You treated me like a resource. There's a significant difference. We never asked you to do anything we wouldn't do ourselves. When was the last time you spent your own money to buy groceries for someone else's family? When have you ever devoted 3 days a week to running errands for people who could afford to handle their own needs?" The question hung in the air without an answer because, of course, they had never made such sacrifices for anyone else. The generosity they had expected from me was generosity they would never have considered providing themselves. "Look," Michael said, his tone becoming more businesslike as he apparently accepted that the conversation was not going to result in my capitulation. "If you're serious about buying the cottage, we'll need to involve our attorneys and real estate agents. This isn't something we can just decide over the phone." "Of course. My attorney will contact yours tomorrow to begin the process. I'm hoping we can close within 3 weeks." 3 weeks? That's not much time. It's a cash transaction with no financing contingencies. There's no reason it should take longer than that. After I hung up, I sat in my new apartment at Sunset Manor, looking around at the space that would be my home for the foreseeable future. I'd moved in the previous week, even before the cottage ownership issue was resolved, because I wanted to establish my independence from Michael and Courtney, regardless of what happened with the property. The apartment was everything I'd hoped for: bright, comfortable, and surrounded by people who shared my interests and values. I'd already joined 3 different clubs, volunteered to help with the community garden, and made more genuine friends in 2 weeks than I'd had in the 6 months I'd lived in the cottage. My phone buzzed with a text message from Frank, the gentleman I'd met at the museum. He was inviting me to join a group that was planning a trip to visit historical sites in San Francisco next month. The kind of invitation that had nothing to do with what I could provide, and everything to do with who I was as a person. 2 days later, I met with Michael, Courtney, and their attorney at the office of my lawyer, Jessica Martinez. The cottage purchase was moving forward smoothly, but I could see that my nephew and his wife were still struggling to process the reality of my financial situation. Mrs. Chen, their attorney, said as we reviewed the purchase documents, "I have to say that your financial documentation is quite impressive. Have you considered what you'll do with the cottage once you own it?" "I'm planning to rent it out," I said. "I've already spoken with a property management company about finding suitable tenants." Courtney looked stricken. "You're going to let strangers live in Dad's cottage?" "I'm going to let people who will appreciate it and treat it with respect live in Robert's cottage. People who understand that housing is a privilege to be grateful for, not a tool to leverage unpaid labor from elderly relatives." Michael cleared his throat. "Aunt Dorothy, about the way things developed between us, I want you to know that we never intended for you to feel exploited. Intent and impact are different things, Michael. I'm sure you didn't intend to exploit me, but that's exactly what happened. And when I tried to establish boundaries, your response was to threaten my housing security rather than examine your own behavior. We were just trying to maintain an arrangement that worked for everyone. An arrangement that worked for you and Courtney at my expense. That's not a sustainable family relationship, Michael. That's a business transaction disguised as generosity." Jessica handed me the final documents to sign, officially making me the owner of the cottage where I'd been exploited and undervalued for 6 months. It felt appropriate that I would reclaim that space and transform it into something positive. "What about the boys?" Courtney asked suddenly. "They're gonna miss having their grandmother nearby." "I'm not their grandmother, Courtney. I'm their great-aunt. And I'll still be in their lives if you want me to be. Just not as your unpaid employee." "We never thought of you as an employee." "Then you should have no trouble adjusting to a relationship that doesn't involve my providing services in exchange for basic courtesy." As we left the lawyer's office, Michael walked with me to my car. "Aunt Dorothy, do you think there's any chance we could start over? Build a better relationship now that we understand the situation differently?" I considered his question carefully. "Michael, that depends entirely on whether you've learned anything from this experience. If you still believe that what happened was a reasonable arrangement that I should have been grateful for, then no, I don't think we can have a healthy relationship. I'm starting to understand that we took advantage of your generosity." "It wasn't generosity, Michael. Generosity is freely given. What you took from me was extracted through manipulation and coercion. There's a significant difference." He was quiet for a moment. "How do we fix this?" "You start by treating me like a person whose time, money, and energy have value. You stop assuming that I'm available to serve your needs whenever convenient. And you acknowledge that family relationships should be based on mutual care and respect, not on one person serving the others. And if we do that..." I looked at this young man who shared Robert's eyes and smile, who had been raised with love and attention, but had somehow learned to view elderly relatives as resources to be utilized rather than people to be cherished. "Then maybe we can build something better than what we had before. But it will be a relationship between equals, Michael. I won't accept anything less." 3 months later, I was hosting a dinner party in my apartment at Sunset Manor, when Michael and his family arrived with flowers and a genuine apology. The boys, who had been told that Great-Aunt Dorothy was now living in a, quote, fancy apartment with lots of friends, were fascinated by the community and the activities they could see through the windows. "Aunt Dorothy," Lisa said, "this place is really cool. Do you like living here?" "I love it," I said honestly. "I have wonderful neighbors, interesting activities, and I get to spend my time doing things I enjoy, instead of things other people expect me to do." The cottage had been rented to a lovely young couple who appreciated its history and character. The rental income provided more than enough to cover my expenses at Sunset Manor, and the property management company handled all the maintenance and tenant relations. Michael and Courtney had initially struggled to adjust to managing their own household needs, but they had eventually developed systems that worked for their family. More importantly, they had learned to plan ahead and budget for their actual expenses, instead of relying on someone else to subsidize their lifestyle. "We brought you something," Tommy said, handing me a card that the boys had made. Inside was a drawing of me surrounded by books and friends, with a message that read, "Thank you for teaching us that family means caring about each other, not just getting help with stuff." It wasn't exactly the apology I might have expected from the adults, but it was acknowledgement that the lesson had been learned and understood, even by the children. As we ate dinner together, I noticed that the conversation was different from our previous interactions. Instead of discussing errands and household management, we talked about the boys, school projects, Michael's work challenges, and my activities at the retirement community. We were relating to each other as people with separate lives and interests, not as a service provider and her clients. "Aunt Dorothy," Courtney said as the evening was winding down, "I want you to know that I've been thinking about what happened between us. I realize now that I took advantage of your kindness, and I'm sorry." "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that. Is there anything we can do to make up for it?" I looked around my comfortable apartment, thinking about the friends I'd made, the activities I enjoyed, and the sense of purpose I'd rediscovered through volunteering and community involvement. "You can treat me like family instead of like staff," I said. "You can value my company for its own sake, not because of what I can provide. And you can remember that elderly people deserve the same respect and consideration as everyone else." "We can do that," Michael said. "We should have been doing that all along." As they prepared to leave, Frank knocked on my door with a group of neighbors who had heard about the family dinner and wanted to meet my relatives. The boys were delighted by the attention, and Michael and Courtney seemed genuinely impressed by the warmth and intelligence of my new community. "Your aunt is quite remarkable," Frank told Michael as they shook hands. "We're very lucky to have her here." "Yes," Michael said, looking at me with what appeared to be genuine respect for the first time since I'd moved to the cottage. "She really is remarkable." After they left, I sat in my living room feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had reclaimed my dignity, established my independence, and created a life that honored both my own worth and Robert's memory. The cottage that had been a symbol of my exploitation was now providing financial security and housing for people who would appreciate it. Most importantly, I had learned that I didn't have to accept less than I deserved, simply because other people expected me to. I had value beyond what I could provide, worth beyond what I could produce, and the power to choose relationships that honored my humanity rather than exploiting my generosity. The phone rang, and I saw it was Eleanor calling for our weekly conversation about books and travel plans. "Dorothy," she said when I answered, "you sound happy." "I am happy," I said, looking around my beautiful apartment filled with evidence of my new life. For the first time in a very long time, I'm exactly where I belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.